Okay, so hi Miriam, how are
Hi,
you?
very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm okay. Do you want to just describe where you're speaking from?
Speaking from my flat in South London in Stockwell.
I'm speaking from Manchester. That the sun has just come out and it's shining into my eyes, but I'm really happy because it hasn't been out at all recently.
Yay!
Um, so it's really nice to have a chance to chat to you about using archive in your work. And
Yeah,
um, I think the week before lockdown happened, we were together in Manchester performing The Great and the Grand,
yeah,
which used some of the museums or a history archive in it. And I just wanted to maybe ask you if you wanted to kind of talk a little bit about The Great and the Grand and how it came about.
yeah. So The Great and the Grand is kind of a spin-off project almost of a show that I made with my two friends, our company Dynamite Island. They are composers. Um, that show is called Rendezvous in Bratislava, and it's a music theatre sort of contemporary documentary cabaret thing about my granddad and his life, even though I never met him. So it's about his life and my relationship to him. And I used a lot of our kind of family archive because he was a prodigious writer and hoarder of things. And yeah, the original idea was I'm really in my interest in theatre is always uh, not really what do I want to say? It's about working with other people who aren't necessarily performers. It's not really about acting or kind of pretending, but about putting someone's story on a stage and having that kind of conversation between them and the audience. And um, the first show that I made was about the history of my local pub, and I started by interviewing lots of local people, and then some of them performed in the show and told their anecdotes about the pub. And so my original idea for Rendezvous was that there would be my granddad's life running through, my story, and also other people's grandparents. And in the end, we kept a tiny smidgen of that because it was just so much material. So we had a little story from one of the other performers about where their grandma was at the moment of the Prague Spring, for example. So The Great and the Grand was sort of born out of that. The idea was to tell other people's grandparents' stories on stage in a kind of cabaret format. So yeah, that was how it came about, and we got some seed funding from Farnham Maltings to try that in Reading. And then we were very, very generously, luckily supported by Manchester Jewish Museum to bring it to Manchester and and work with different people everywhere we go. So we sort of conceive of it like a traveling circus cabaret thing where we roll up to the town and we look for grandchildren in the town who want to who are interested, who don't have to have any kind of performance experience. They just want to tell the story of their, or talk about their grandparents.
I think that's really interesting. It felt like you'd rolled into town. We had a month, or you were rolling into town every week for about a month, weren't you? And for me, being involved in that, I think what was really interesting was how people's personal archive and also the institutional archive were being used in that process of co-creation. And I hadn't really experienced before, in terms of co-creation, using institutional archive and really interweaving it, because I think that's kind of, there's one thing, isn't there, for participants to be able to draw on their own experiences and their own family histories, and yet another thing for them to take on the family histories of the other people in the group, actually. So there's a kind of a communal archive that was being created that felt like to me, and then to take on those more historical stories that we have in the oral histories in our collection, people describing their grandparents from quite a distance. I don't know how you felt about that process. It was kind of multi-layered for me, I think.
It was beautiful. We had the first version we did of The Great and the Grand. We had kind of, whenever in all the projects where I've worked with people, it's sort of about, like you said, creating a new archive of those people's material and their lives. And so we had done that in Reading by interviewing lots of people, and we included audio clips of those sort of current oral histories. But yeah, in Manchester was the first time that we'd brought together those different things, because one of our favourite things to do to generate material is to talk about our grandparents, and to record that and then listen back. So kind of instantly archiving ourselves and then listening back and then treating that as material. And this was the first time that we had both that and Manchester Jewish Museum's oral histories at the same time, and we could kind of work to combine them. And I think that's just, it just makes total sense, because I really like that feeling of, the feeling that you get of being part of history, you know, that we are in the present, we are a future, in the future we'll be a past, and it's kind of and we had this amazing real stroke of luck with the project, that one of our participants who was coming every week, her grandma had been interviewed in the 70s, I think.
Late 70s, early 80s. I think one of the earlier recordings that we have.
And so we were listening to Tilly in those sort of Manchester Jewish Museum's official, you know, oral history archive, like this is a piece of history. And then we had her actual granddaughter in the room, and we were able to use both, like work with that, and we had her live in the performance telling us a bit about her grandma, and then we watched her while we listened to her grandma talking. And
I think that gets away, doesn't it, that idea that history is linear. Actually, we weren't so much aware in the project. I wasn't really aware of historically where those voices were placed. And it becomes a much more cyclical process, or imagining of history that's much more cyclical than that traditional, you know, quite masculine, I suppose, version of history that is progressive and linear, and that was really highlighted in Tilly's,
and it's a dialogue.
And that you can speak across those. Yes, you can flip across those historical differences.
And that was something that was really important to me in the show, in Rendezvous in Bratislava. Like, it kind of culminates in a conversation between the whole show is really a conversation between me and my granddad, and just by us both kind of being heard in the same space.
Across a certain space, or those creations of different spaces within a work. Should we maybe listen to the clip of Tilly so we can hear her voice? But one of the amazing things about Tilly is that she's got this incredible sort of way of speaking, and maybe we'll have just a little listen, because that was one of the things we were playing around with in the project, about how the voices were sounding.
I love this clip because she's just got such an amazing personality. Often I find when I interview people about their grandparents, a common thing people say is, she was such a personality, or, you know, he was such a big personality, and you think, oh, but give me an example. And because we have this record, you know, it's not just, for me, it's not like, what specific story she's telling, or I know those are things are really important that we hear for proper historical records, that we know what conditions were like and things like that. But it's really like just capturing her whole personality that's amazing. So I'll just play the very beginning of this.
Were distantly related.
Do you know what year they married?
I beg your pardon?
Do you know what year they married?
Now, what year did they get married in? You'll not believe this if I tell you. They got married about 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years before I was born, but you had to pay 1 7 for a birth certificate, and they never could muster the 1 7 after they got married. I'm mixing one thing, and this is what they told me, remember.
I just love how she like interrupts herself and really evokes the feeling of a real person.
You can hear the cogs turning and the kind of memory being created or recreated inside somebody, I think.
Yeah, and that's also so much more honest about history, you know, that we, all of it is filtered through somebody's memory or feeling, and this just feels real.
I think there is so I work a lot with the oral histories, and there is that sense of you really get connected to somebody through their voice. It's quite powerful, for me, more powerful than perhaps material cultures, but I find I'm in danger sometimes of viewing Mancunian Jewish history as told by a certain person. So for me, there's a woman called Clara Weingard, whose oral history is so rich. She's born in Cheetham, but the way she describes her childhood and the society around that, she becomes the go-to person. And again, she's quite similar to Tilly. She's got a very sort of characterful voice. Actually, should we listen to her talking about her Romanian grandmother?
Yeah, that's a lovely clip.
It's an interesting example of somebody talking about their own grandparents, and yeah, she's talking about what character her grandmother is, where actually she's the character that we're interested in almost.
Went to London. My grandmother never stayed here. She went to live in London, and she married a London bloke. Why did she go to London? My grandmother was a very vivacious modern woman for those days, you know. I remember she was very smart, and she used to say, "You must walk with your shoulders thrown back, tummy pressed in, you know. You must be noticed wherever you go as outstanding." Oh yeah, she was. And she used to sit there with a cigarette in a cigarette holder. Well, as I say, from Romania, she was like more or less a lady, you know. But here, when she came to England, she had to rough it. But she still kept the very good ideas. She was very clean and very smart. And we saw her in the years. She was in London, and we were here. My mother got married very early. She was 15 years of age. And she was very...
So that perhaps there isn't really, I don't know, there's nothing necessarily inherently Jewish perhaps about that description of the grandmother, but the connections with for people, their own grandmothers from whatever community you're from, is so strong, I think. I love the thing about the cigarette hold, like looking. Cigarette holder.
And I also want to go back to what you're saying about the kind of cadences and things, because it would be like a really big, huge disservice to the Great and the Grand of Manchester not to talk about the way that that Tom, one of the company, used another oral history, Jaime's oral history, and turned it into a kind of spoken word opera, and that was also really fun and a completely different way of thinking about the material. So we listened to his story, but we tried really hard as a group to listen to the things that were particular about the way he was speaking, and tried to kind of identify melodies and particular phrases and the way he said things, and then we tried to repeat them and make them musical. And he had a lot of pauses, like really long pauses. So the piece that Tom created ended up sort of interjecting quotes from Jaime into his own pauses, and that was just so fun and so rich. You know, it's like this type of material has so many possibilities for different ways to work with it. And
it's interesting, isn't it, once you move beyond so as someone who was part of the group that were interjecting, I can't now tell you what he was saying, but I can hear his cadences, the rhythm of his voice, and there is something about just connecting with somebody in an empathetic way, I suppose, through copying their rhythm.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. It was also technically really difficult. I remember that bit of the performance was the one that it was just one of those kind of games where you had to, there was a lot of counting involved, so you got it in the right bit. And that was the thing. I think the group, I remember talking to some of the members of the group afterwards, that we just desperately want, we would have loved to have done that again, to have practiced that up.
It was an experiment.
Yeah, and for the most part, the performance itself, we had 4 weeks. It was chaotic on the day itself, wasn't it? Well, it was for me. But there was a kind of rough and ready nature of that performance that was really authentic. I remember audience members saying that they really enjoyed it because it wasn't perfect. But that little bit with Jaime's little bit in the middle was the one bit that I wanted to, that I would have loved us to have perfected a little bit more. Maybe we'll have to have a replay of it.
I think it's a fun way of exploring a different way in. Maybe it was also, like you said, it also abstracted it, and just used it as, in a way, like you said, we don't necessarily remember what he was saying. We kind of using it for its the kind of musical gift of it. And maybe people don't really talk like that anymore, so it's another kind of history of talking and voice, and that's separate to the actual kind of words.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you get a sense of how the audience kind of reacted to the use of archive? Did people talk to you about it afterwards?
Well, people, I know that in some of the feedback forms, people mentioned, like, specifically sort of discovering things, learning things through Tilly's oral history that they found very interesting. People tend to come and tell me about their own grandparents, which is sort of the point and part of the extension, and we try to make the audience feel like they're also participants, and we have different ways to include them. And we also did a timeline, and we have all our grandparents interwoven, which included Tilly, and people were really sort of interested in that. We had it up in the room, and people were checking it out afterwards. I think I mean, I just know what works for me, and for me, having different ways in to that kind of historical material is the most effective way for me to connect to it and find out something new. So I hope it worked for other people.
I feel like it's a different way to access that history, isn't it? That the people in the audience wouldn't necessarily come to the museum and listen to I think there are probably about 3 or 4 people who have ever listened to the Harmon Tilly's recording is hours and hours and hours long. Although her granddaughter has now got that recording for herself at home that she's been listening to her, and there's something really nice about that, because she didn't know her. She died when her granddaughter was fairly young, so they didn't have a kind of really, as far as I'm aware, they didn't have a really extended relationship. So there's something really nice about having that I don't have a recording of my grandparents' voices, actually, and I don't think that many people do. So what a privilege.
I think that's also something that people think about. That's something that when people come and talk to me after Rendezvous as well, like, it's often about what do they have left of their grandparents. Like, I am so privileged to have this huge record that my granddad and my grandma left behind on my mum's side. And some people only have one photo or one story. And it often, yeah, people say that they feel afterwards that they want to go and ask their parents more questions, or their grandparents if they're still alive.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite common. There was one comment I remember from the feedback forms about somebody, you know, kind of remembering their grandmother whilst they were listening, but making connections between particularly the Jewish stories that are interwoven in the piece and the Windrush generation, and suggesting that we do something around the, you know, the connecting those two things. So I have in my head that, you know, maybe actually the archives are a way to access things on a very at a very specific level, but to engage the global. It's through the specificity, isn't it, that you find the kind of global connections. So next time. Next project. Great.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I hope this has been kind of useful for other people to kind of think about how they might use oral histories in kind of co-creative participatory pieces, because
I hope so.
Yeah, here's to that. Cool. Okay, I'm going to stop